Death at Devil's Bridge. Chapter 20. When the cook and the steward fall out, we hear who stole the butter. Dutch proverb. "Here's the list, Harriet," Sarah Pratt said, giving the daily garden order to the kitchen maid. "And mind you, don't let Thompson give you any back chat. This is what's wanted, no more, no less. And if he's got any problem with it, you can tell him kindly to come and speak with me." "Yes, Mrs. Pratt," Harriet said demurely. She went off with a spring in her step, for today was Sunday, and she was to have half a holiday that afternoon. Lady Catherine preferred light meals for the household on the Sabbath, so the order was not large, only a basket of French beans and a bunch of New Zealand spinach for the upstairs dinner, and 2 collards and a basket of broad beans for the servants' hall. When Harriet had collected the vegetables from Thompson, she would carry them in baskets suspended from a yoke across her shoulders into the vegetable pantry, where she would place the beans and greens into their appropriate slats and replenish the wooden bowls of water that kept them fresh until it was time to prepare them. When the girl had gone, Sarah poured herself a cup of tea and sat down with it at the scrubbed pine table. Tranquility had been restored to her kitchen with the return of her cherished iron range, and she was comforted by the fragrant pot of soup stock that simmered congenially on the back of the vast stove, and the 3 pigeon pies bubbling in the oven, and the trough of dough put down before the fire to rise. But peace had not been restored to Sarah's spirit. She was in possession of 2 rather important mysteries. At least, she thought that they might be important. No, that they must be important, and she was much troubled as to what to do with them. At household prayers that Sabbath morning, she had offered up special petition for help in resolving these matters, and now she sat at the table with her tea and waited for help to come to her. One of these mysteries involved her friend Bess Girton. On the way home from her sister's birthday supper Friday night, Sarah had encountered Bess, wrapped like a pharaoh's mummy in a black shawl and skulking around Lord Marston's motor car like a common thief. Questioned, Bess had stammered out that she'd come to see the balloon before it flew away the next morning, and had stopped to peek at the motor car to see whether it was every bit as dangerous as she had remembered it. "I meant to put me head in the kitchen door," she added, "but the light was out and I thought you had already taken yourself off to bed." Sarah had not believed a word of this voluble stream of protestations. She and Bess had both grown up along Black Brook, playing together in the strip of garden that separated their 2 cottages, shooing the hens off of their nests in the little shed at the foot of the garden to steal their eggs, and spending hours on their stomachs lying under the bushes at the mill, watching the fat corn sacks being hauled up by a pulley from the great yellow 4-horse wagons. But as they grew older, Bess had gone her own independent and willful way, neither marrying nor going into service, but supporting herself by her own wits and gaining a reputation in the village for all sorts of sinister nonsense. Witchery nonsense, that is, like that practiced by Bess's grandmother Girton, who was reputed by some of Dedham's older inhabitants to have been adept in the black arts. If those old folks spied Gamma Girton lingering too close to a cow or a sheep that had happened the next day to fall ill or injure a hoof upon a stone, they knew exactly who and what to blame. And Sarah, while she was not very superstitious, firmly believed that Bess Girton had been up to something wicked on Friday night, something that had to do with the balloon and Lord Marston's motor car, and perhaps with the pig's blood that Bess had begged of her several weeks back. At the time of the request, Sarah had surmised that Bess might be planning to employ the blood in some sort of charm or a bit of magic, and wondered whether it was right to give it to her. But Sarah did not really believe that Bess could do any damage with her spells, and Bess was a friend. In the end, Sarah had reluctantly obliged. Now, however, in the light of what had happened to both the balloon and Lord Bradford's motor car, Sarah thought she should not have been so quick to assist Bess in her mischief, whatever it actually was. Sarah was not very superstitious indeed, but one had to keep an open mind on such matters, and it was still whispered among the village oldsters that Bess's grandmother had been seen now and again to fly. Bess might not be to blame for what had happened to the balloon and the motor car, but then again she might, and some might even argue that Sarah herself was to blame for giving Bess what she had asked for. But Bess was not the only friend with whom Sarah had a falling out. The other was Squire Thornton. Not a friend exactly, but someone of whom Sarah had thought highly. She had grown up on one of the outlying farms of Thornton Grange, and her mother and father had been tenants of Squire Thornton's father, and his own tenants until their death some few years before. The present squire, while not by nature a generous man, had allowed the old people to stay in their cottage for a month or two without any payment or rent, and Sarah had been grateful. What she had seen him do at the time of the balloon launch had therefore filled her with a great shame. She was even more shamed and angered as well when she reflected that someone else had gotten the blame for the squire's action. Tom Whipple, who had courted Sarah when she was still a girl, before she had lengthened her skirts and put her hair up, who had sworn to love her forever even though she refused him and married Pratt instead. Worse luck. Whipple, who, though headstrong and impetuous, was just a man and true as steel. Whipple had been blamed, and Sarah knew for certain fact that he was not at fault, for she knew who was. Should she tell? Who should she tell? And how could she tell it without the squire hearing that she was the one who had revealed his deception? Sarah was turning these matters over in her mind when Lady Catherine opened the courtyard door and came into the kitchen, bringing with her the chill, fresh air. Ladies, Sarah had been told, never used the courtyard door, but dismounted from their carriages and came through their fine front entrances. But her ladyship, an American and Irish, stood on no ceremony where doors were concerned, leaving every door in the house standing ajar so that air might circulate from room to room, and using whichever door she pleased, even when the courtyard door that led from the garden and stables into the kitchen, and the green baize door that divided the house into upper and lower. Miss Audley, Lady Catherine as she was now, following her marriage to Sir Charles, had been headstrong and individual since her first arrival at Bishop's Keep, and no amount of remonstrance was likely ever going to change her. To tell the truth, Sarah Pratt admired her ladyship's progressive, not to say radical ways, her American practicality and lack of pretense, and her stories. For Sarah was fully aware that her ladyship regularly occupied herself as an authoress, and that she concealed her work under the name of Beryl Bardwell, whose numerous detective stories featured fascinating fearless women, and whose reputation was virtually certain to some day equal that of Conan Doyle and his precious Sherlock Holmes. "Good morning, Mrs. Pratt," Lady Catherine said, taking off her woolen hat and dropping it on the table. In the way of hats and garments, too, her ladyship differed greatly from other fine ladies, preferring a modest hat without frills, or a woolen cloche, and insisting, even for Sunday services, on sensible boots and a rational dress that allowed her greater freedom of movement, like the shorter narrow skirt of the brown suit she was wearing. "Good morning, your ladyship," Sarah said. Lady Catherine cast a look in the direction of the kitchen range. "I am glad to see that things are back to normal once more, Mrs. Pratt. If you like, I shall speak to Sir Charles about leaving your iron range where it is and installing the gas cooker somewhere else. In the pantry, perhaps." Sarah beamed. "The pantry will do very well, ma'am," she said gratefully. "Thank you, your ladyship." And then, like a flash, it came to Sarah that the help she had hoped and prayed for might be standing right here in front of her, in the very flesh as it were. For who was Lady Catherine but Beryl Bardwell, the solver of insoluble mysteries, and who better than Beryl Bardwell, the female Conan Doyle, to give her the answers she was seeking? "I wonder, ma'am," she said, "if you have time to give me a word or two of advice." Kate's drive from the village back to Bishop's Keep had taken her through a very pretty lane, with a frosty air presaged early autumn. The coming weeks were the time of year that Kate loved the most, when the woods garbed themselves in a kind of contradictory magnificence, at once splendidly gaudy and quietly sombre. The birch and oak would soon be wearing bright yellow, while the beech and larch on the hill would blaze a deep copper and orange. The edges of the fields would be frilled with the sweet pink of campion and the more modest flush of willow herb. The brash magenta of loosestrife might still enliven the brookside. Charles would take her through the woods and show her the wonders of English fungi, some the size of the tiniest pearl buttons, some bigger than a basin, and magnificently coloured white, black, cream, purple, yellow, and scarlet. And the prickly chestnut would come showering down around them, their cream-coloured cups opening to show the chestnuts like shiny dark pearls inside. While Kate was thus happily anticipating the coming autumn, she had also been turning over in her mind the information that she had gleaned that morning. Having concluded that she could do little to help Lawrence, that was up to Charles, who seemed to have the investigation fully in hand, she turned her attention to Squire Thornton, who figured mysteriously large in the course of the last few weeks' events. The new gig and splendid bonnet were Thornton's gift, and he had insisted that Jessup give the credit for them to Charles Rolls, thereby making it seem to any who heard of it that Rolls had assumed responsibility for old Jessup's death. The squire had also stood bail for Whipple, who was thought to have pulled the grapnel from the gondola. Knowing him to be a hard man, Kate did not for a moment believe that the squire had acted out of the generosity of his heart where either Jessup's or Tom Whipple were concerned. Why, then, had he acted? Why had he been so eager to part with his money? Kate was still mulling over these questions when she arrived at Bishop's Keep. She had handed Macaroni's reins to Pocket and entered the house the most convenient way, encountering Cook in the kitchen. A few moments later she found herself seated at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, listening with some surprise as Mrs. Pratt poured forth her mysteries. The first, which had something to do with pig's blood and witchcraft, and a friend of Mrs. Pratt who had been seen lurking about on a dark night, was rather too incoherent to easily be teased out. The second, however, brought her once to attention. "Squire Thornton," she exclaimed. "You saw Squire Thornton pull the grapnel out of the gondola." "That I did, your ladyship," Miss Pratt said stoutly. "I'd just come through the garden from talking with Thompson about the artichokes for dinner, ma'am. He'd sent word he's had only half a dozen, and that wouldn't be nearly enough. You'll remember as we serve only the bottoms on the plates, and would have to have 3 dozen at least. When Thompson sent me the bad news, I had to go down to the garden and see what could be put in place of the missing bottoms." She frowned in the remembered annoyance. "But Thompson, I believe I understand why you were out and about that morning, Mrs. Pratt," Kate put in hurriedly. "Why don't you just tell me what you saw?" "What I saw," Mrs. Pratt said with some energy, "was the squire marching up to the balloon, shouting and waving his arms. Sir Charles and that other man, Mr. Rolls. Sir Charles and Mr. Rolls was busy trying to get ready to go, and there was a great deal of shouting and shoving, so the squire just reached out his hand and pulled that big fish hook right off the basket and dropped it on the ground. Afterwards, poor Whipple got the blame, and the constable took him off to jail." She shook her head sorrowfully. "God knows what's to become of him." "Nothing has become of him," Kate said. "The constable determined that there was not enough evidence to charge him with the offence. He was charged with disorderly conduct, however, and Squire Thornton stood his bail." "It was no more than he should do," said Mrs. Pratt indignantly, "allowing poor Whipple to be taken off to jail for something he did himself." She was quiet for a moment. "But I am glad to hear it, I am," she added in a softer tone. "It settles me mind with regard to the squire. I reckon he'll give Whipple somewhat to make it good." "I suppose he will," Kate said, wondering what she should do with this new bit of information. Of itself, of course, the intelligence had very little significance, but taken together with the rest of what had been learned that morning, it seemed important, very important in fact. If the squire had sabotaged the balloon, very nearly resulting in the death of both Charles and the Honourable Mr. Rolls, was it possible that he had also tampered with the brake on Bradford's motor car, resulting in Albert's death? That question reminded her of another, and she hastened to ask it. "Mrs. Pratt, do you recall those 3 small crockery pots of mustard that were sent to us from France? I should like to see them, if you don't mind." Mrs. Pratt stared at her eyes narrowing. "Mustard pots? All 3? "Yes. Is there a problem?" Miss Pratt bit her lip nervously. How about 2, your ladyship? Will they do?" "Where is the 3rd? "The 3rd? Well, you see, your ladyship, that is, She stopped, looked at the clock and cried, "Oh, laws, but it's time to start the luncheon." Jumping up from the table, she went to the range, picked up a wooden spoon and began to stir the soup with rather more violence than what was necessary. Kate rose too and went to stand beside her. "Mrs. Pratt," she said gently, "did our Amelia borrow the 3rd mustard pot?" "Amelia!" Mrs. Pratt exclaimed, turning round. "Oh, no, your ladyship." "If Amelia didn't take it, who did?" Kate asked gently. "Miss Pratt, the missing mustard pot by itself is of no importance to me. I am seeking only to get to the bottom of a very troublesome matter, and the pot may help to do so. Please tell me, who has the mustard pot?" Mrs. Pratt hung her head. "I gave it to Bess for a birthday full of quince jam. 'Twas the night she got tumbled into the ditch by Lord Marston's motor car when she come to fetch pig's blood." "Bess?" Kate asked, confused. "Pig's blood?" So then she had to hear the story of Bess all over again from beginning to end, or at least to the point on Friday night at which Mrs. Pratt had observed her lurking near Lord Marston's motor car. This time, Kate understood far more than she had before, enough to persuade her that she needed to speak to Bess Gurton immediately. "This Bess," she said. "Where may I find her?" "Find her?" Miss Pratt asked wonderingly. "Why on earth would your ladyship want to—" "So that I may speak with her, of course," Kate said, impatient. "It's urgent that I learn what she was doing here on Friday night." Mrs. Pratt reflected. "Well," she said at last, "you must take the lane to the village, but you don't go quite that far. You just go to Ashton Cross, one lane beyond, then turn to the right and go as far as the lane which ends at Black Brook. And after that, get your shawl, Mrs. Pratt," Kate said, taking the spoon from her. "Me shawl, ma'am, and your bonnet. I shall never find that cottage by myself. And anyway, Mistress Gurton is more likely to be willing to speak to me if you are present, and there to encourage her. Now come along." "But what about the luncheon?" Miss Pratt cried, hanging back. "Luncheon can wait," Kate said firmly, and marched her cook to the door. "This business is more important than a bit of cold joint and a pudding."